good note from the governor's presentation was his call for more federal funds. However, I do want to say that the way he is approaching the federal government, I would certainly approach differently. I think if you look at his essential message, it's that if we don't get $8 billion from the federal government, then we are going to make these draconian cuts. To me, what this amounts to is the governor shifting his tactic. Typically, he threatens the legislature. Now he's threatening the President of the United States. I have difficulty with that. In his State of the State, he didn't mention it today, but in his State of the State, he called on our congressional delegation to vote against health care reform. And this is a governor who a few years ago was leading the charge in the nation through fighting for health care reform in the state of California. I don't think it's a good way to start off the new year by approaching our congressional delegation in that manner and the administration. You know from the beginning that we have always talked about, and I do like the fact that he is making some of the same calls that we have been making for years, which is we need to get more return on our dollar. For every dollar that we send in, we get 78 cents back. I like hearing him saying that. And I also like hearing him saying that we need to look at the formulas. But I do think that we need to approach the federal government from a point of collaboration and not threats. Ironically, the other day on the Assembly floor and in the Senate, we passed Race to the Top legislation, and we heard the governor call for education reform, and in particular looking at the lowest achieving schools and making sure that those kids are not trapped in those schools, and that's why we passed Race to the Top. I think that it is a huge conflict and contradiction to say that we care about those kids from 8 to 3. But once they get out of those schools, we don't necessarily care whether they have food, whether they have shelter, whether their parents are employed, or whether they're on the street. We have to look at the safety net in its entirety. We support education reform. We want that additional money from the federal government for Race to the Top, but we can't dismantle parts of the safety net that also apply to the same kids that we're talking about in Race to the Top. I have to say that I will be interested in looking in detail at some of his proposals. I do believe that he is slipping policy issues in there that really amount to his concern over his legacy. When we are talking about fund shifts and revenues, we are talking about those on a temporary basis. When we are looking at cuts, those cuts would be in place permanently. We do know that there are several areas that the governor would like to change. He mentioned in his State of the State, didn't mention today so much, but absolutely apply to the budget. He talked about changes in CEQA. He talked about changes in lawsuits. He talked about combating fraud. He talked about pensions. He talked about repealing public-private partnerships when they come to education. I happen to believe that this is a part of him fighting for his legacy. I think it's a conservative agenda. I do not believe that we should take advantage of the budget crisis to move areas of public policy that ordinarily would not survive the legislative process. So having said all of that, the governor did say that he is somewhat in denial that this is his last year in office. It is also my last year in office. I'm not in denial about that. But when I do look at his budget proposals, they seem to be a big pile of denial. I don't think there's any way, anyhow, you can talk about eliminating health care to children in a time in our nation when we're talking about expanding health care. When it comes to CalWORKs, again, I'm talking about the kids that we're concerned about from 8 to 3, but don't care if they eat afterwards. You will find that fighting for taxes is not going to be the centerpiece on how we're going to respond to this budget. But given that we are facing another record deficit, we have to say that all of the tools will be on the table, and we're not going to take anything off of the table.